In the fall of 2019, I set out on a solo backpacking trip through a stretch of the Appalachian Trail in western North Carolina. It wasn't my first time hiking alone, and I'd done this section before, so I felt confident. I planned a 3-day loop, carrying only what I needed, with 2 nights scheduled at remote shelters. The weather was perfect: cool, dry air, leaves peeking in shades of gold and red, and barely another soul in sight. That kind of solitude is what I live for. Just the steady sound of boots on packed dirt, the smell of pine and damp leaves, and the rustling of unseen animals in the underbrush. I reached the first shelter by late afternoon, a small wooden lean-to nestled just off the trail, surrounded by dense forest. There was no one else around. I made a small fire in the pit, cooked a simple meal, and relaxed against my pack, perfectly content. But shortly after sunset, the air changed, and I realized the forest no longer felt as empty as it had before. At first, it was just a sense, like I was being watched, even though I hadn't heard a single sound. I stood up and slowly looked around, my eyes adjusting to the deepening shadows between the trees. Nothing moved. No wind, no rustling. I chalked it up to nerves and sat back down, pulling my jacket tighter around me as the fire cracked softly. But then, from somewhere off to my left, maybe 20 or 30 yards into the woods, I heard what sounded like a footstep. Just one. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. I froze, listening. It didn't come again. Deer, I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. Black bears, deer, even coyotes were normal out here, but there was something about the way that step had sounded. Heavy. Intentional. I stood again, this time with my flashlight, and swept the beam through the trees. Nothing. Just trunks and shadows. I waited, heart thudding, but the sound didn't return. I tried to brush it off and decided to turn in early. I doused the fire, zipped into my sleeping bag inside the lean-to, and lay listening to the forest settle. But sleep didn't come easy. Every time I was close to drifting off, I'd hear something faint, like a twig snapping or soft movement just beyond the tree line. Around midnight, I heard what I can only describe as quiet humming. Not a melody, just a low, aimless drone coming from the same direction I'd heard the footstep. It was so faint, I thought I might be imagining it. I sat up and held my breath. The humming stopped. That's when I realized something that chilled me more than the sound itself. I hadn't seen a single hiker all day. This part of the trail wasn't completely isolated, especially not during peak hiking season. But I hadn't passed a soul. The sudden quiet, the strange noises, and the absence of other hikers, it all started to feel deliberate. Around 2 a.m. I was still wide awake, lying perfectly still and staring at the roof of the shelter. That's when I heard something move, closer this time. Not an animal. I know the difference. These were slow, shuffling footsteps, like someone walking barefoot through leaves, dragging slightly with each step. They came from the direction of the trail and stopped just behind the shelter. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. My pack was hanging on a peg outside, and I suddenly regretted leaving my knife in the side pocket. Then, the footsteps resumed, this time circling the shelter slowly, deliberately, as if whoever it was wanted me to hear them. I was paralyzed. My flashlight was at arm's reach, but I didn't dare turn it on. Then, as quickly as they had started, the footsteps faded back into the woods. I lay there in total darkness, convinced that if I made a sound, they'd come back. I must have drifted off at some point, because I woke up to pale morning light filtering through the trees. Everything looked normal again, quiet, peaceful, almost like the night hadn't happened. But I didn't waste time. I packed my gear in under 5 minutes and hit the trail without even making breakfast. As I hiked, I kept glancing behind me, convinced someone was following just out of sight. A few hours in, I passed a small side trail I'd never noticed before, marked with a stack of oddly shaped stones, perfectly balanced, like a marker of some kind. Something about it felt off. The path wasn't on my map, and it didn't look maintained. I kept walking, but maybe half a mile later, I saw something that made me stop cold. Wedged into a branch above the trail was a strip of cloth, faded red and clearly torn from clothing. It was tied deliberately, like a marker, and it hadn't been there the day before. I stood there for a long time, staring at the cloth. It fluttered slightly in the breeze, like it was trying to get my attention. I looked around and listened. Nothing but the usual forest sounds. Against my better judgment, I stepped off the trail and followed the direction the cloth was pointing. The trees grew denser, and the air somehow felt heavier, like the deeper I went, the more the forest pushed back. Maybe 100 yards in, I found another marker, this time a pile of bones, small animal bones, arranged in a spiral at the base of a tree. I felt something deep in my gut telling me to turn around, but I kept going, heart pounding. Then I saw it, a clearing up ahead, surrounded by crude wooden stakes driven into the ground, all of them tied with bits of red fabric. In the center stood a man, pale, still, wearing only loose black robes. He was facing away from me, but I knew, somehow, I was the reason he was standing there. I stopped behind a tree, barely daring to breathe. The man didn't move, not even a twitch. His posture was strange, rigid like a statue, arms hanging unnaturally straight at his sides. I was about to back away when he slowly raised one arm and pointed directly to his right, toward a narrow trail leading deeper into the woods. He still hadn't turned around. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. Then, from that narrow path, I saw movement. 3 more figures emerging silently from the trees. All of them dressed the same. Loose black robes, faces obscured by cloth hoods tied with red string. They moved with an eerie, synchronized calm, never looking at each other or speaking. I backed away slowly, careful not to make noise. But the first man finally turned his head. I only saw a glimpse of his face. White eyes, mouth slack, skin cracked like dried clay. I turned and ran, crashing through the brush, with branches whipping at my face. I didn't stop running until I was sure I'd put at least a mile between me and that clearing. My lungs burned, legs shaking, ears straining for the sound of pursuit, but the forest was dead quiet again. Too quiet. I stumbled back onto the main trail, nearly collapsing from relief, and forced myself to keep moving. My plan was to make it to the next shelter, rest, then hike out early the next morning. But around late afternoon, I came to a section of trail that felt wrong. The trees were different, thicker, darker bark, and the undergrowth had thinned out unnaturally. And then I saw them again. Not the robed figures, but more of those stone stacks, dozens of them lining the trail like silent sentinels. I hadn't seen them here yesterday. I hurried past them, heart hammering, eyes darting to every shadow. For the rest of the day I didn't hear birds, didn't see a squirrel. Just those stone stacks watching me. That night, I didn't bother with a fire. I set up my tent in a small hollow just off the trail and kept my knife within reach. I barely ate. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being herded, guided somehow, like those fabric strips and stone piles were funneling me towards something I wasn't meant to see. Sleep came in shallow bursts, filled with twisted dreams I couldn't remember after waking. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of chanting. Low, rhythmic, and distant, but getting closer. I stayed completely still, gripping the knife in both hands. The chanting grew louder, more voices joining in, layered like some chaotic hymn. Then came the light, soft, flickering, like fire carried by a dozen people. Shadows danced just beyond the tree line, tall and distorted. I thought I saw hoods. I thought I heard my name whispered beneath the chant. And just like before, it all stopped at once. Silence, as if none of it had ever happened. I broke camp before dawn, unable to take another second in that place. I hiked nonstop, barely pausing for water, driven by a primal urge to get out. When I finally reached the ranger station near the southern terminus that afternoon, I was filthy, dehydrated, and completely rattled. I asked one of the staff if they'd heard of strange gatherings in the area, cults, hermits, anything. The ranger just gave me a blank stare and said, "People see things out there all the time. The forest's old, it holds things." That was it. No report, no concern. I never told anyone else, not really. What could I say? That I wandered into some ritual in the woods? That I was followed by silent men in black robes? Sometimes, even now, I wake up in the middle of the night convinced I hear that chant again, low, layered, and distant. I haven't hiked alone since, and I never, ever leave the trail. We reached the trailhead just as the sun dipped below the ridgeline, casting the forest in a cool blue haze. It was supposed to be a simple overnight hike, nothing too rugged, just a few miles to the campground nestled by a stream. There were 4 of us, Me, my best friend Maya, and two others, Leah and Jess, who were newer to hiking but excited for the adventure. The lot was empty when we arrived, which felt odd for a weekend during peak season, but we chalked it up to luck. The silence was thick as we started, our boots crunching softly on gravel and leaves. Trees towered above us, their silhouettes blending into the darkening sky. We laughed and joked at first, but after 10 minutes in, the mood shifted. None of us said anything, but I could tell we all felt it, like we were being watched. I told myself it was just the twilight messing with my nerves. As we pressed deeper into the forest, the laughter faded into an uneasy quiet. The trail narrowed, weaving through darker groves where the trees grew unnaturally close together. The sun had almost vanished behind the ridge, casting long blue shadows across the dirt path. That's when we noticed the silence, not just a lack of people, but of everything. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. Just the crunch of our boots and our own breathing. Maya slowed, brow furrowed. "Do you hear that?" she asked, barely above a whisper. We all stopped. At first there was nothing. Then came a sound, faint like someone speaking far off, too soft to make out, but definitely human. Jess forced a laugh. "Probably someone ahead of us," she said, but we hadn't passed a single person in hours. Leah hugged herself. "Let's just get to the campsite," she muttered. But I could tell, none of us wanted to keep going. We made it to the campsite just as the last of the daylight faded. It was a small clearing surrounded by pine trees, completely deserted. No signs of other hikers, no flickering campfires in the distance, just silence. We set up quickly, trying to brush off the unease. Leah started unpacking the sleeping bags while Jess gathered wood for a small fire. I wandered a bit, scanning the woods, half expecting someone to step out. That's when we heard it again, a voice, low and whispering, drifting through the trees. This time, it said something unmistakable. My name. I froze. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Maya looked at me and slowly nodded, her face pale. "It said your name." Jess turned on her flashlight and aimed it toward the trail, but the trees just swallowed the light. From that point on, none of us said much. We stayed close to the fire, huddled together like something was waiting just out of reach. The temperature dropped fast, sharper than we expected for early fall. We zipped up our jackets and sat close to the fire, but even the flames didn't feel warm enough. Every so often, we'd hear a twig snap in the distance, or a faint rustle in the underbrush, but when we pointed our flashlights, there was never anything there. Then Leah stood up suddenly, staring into the woods. "Did you see that?" she whispered. We all followed her gaze, but the shadows just shifted like usual. "Something moved," she said, backing up toward us. I was about to say she was probably just tired when the fire flickered violently, flaring up and then shrinking into embers without any wind. We all jumped to our feet. Jess tried to relight it, but the matches kept going out, like the air itself was rejecting the flame. "We should go back," Maya said, but no one moved. It felt like something had settled around the clearing, watching, waiting for night to fully fall. We tried to shake it off, telling each other it was just nerves, the isolation playing tricks on us. But unease clung to everything. The forest, once peaceful, now felt like it was holding its breath. We stayed close, whispering instead of speaking normally, and kept our lights trained on the trees. Then the whispering started. At first we thought it was wind through the branches, soft and broken, but then it turned rhythmic, like a chant just barely out of earshot. We froze. "Do you hear that?" Leah asked, her voice barely audible. Jess nodded, eyes wide. The sound came from deeper in the woods, and it was getting closer. Maya stepped back, flashlight shaking in her hand, and suddenly collapsed. No warning, no cry, just dropped like her strings had been cut. We rushed to her, but she was out cold, breathing shallow and fast. Jess started panicking, saying her name over and over. We hadn't even pitched the tent yet. We were completely exposed, and something was clearly wrong. Maya's sudden collapse sent a cold chill through all of us, freezing the air like a dark omen. Jess and Leah rushed to her side, shaking her gently, calling her name, but Maya stayed completely unresponsive, eyes closed, body limp. Our fear deepened as the distant chanting grew louder, echoing all around us like it was closing in. Then, without warning, Jess's eyes snapped open, and they weren't her own anymore. Her gaze was empty, dark, as if something else had taken control inside her. She stood slowly, stiff but deliberate, a strange smile curling at the corners of her lips. "It's time," she whispered, her voice cold and unnatural. Lee and I exchanged terrified glances. We tried to grab her, but she pushed us away effortlessly. The forest closed in, shadows twisting unnaturally, alive with something malevolent. Jess was possessed. Staying was no longer an option. We had to get out, fast. Leah grabbed Jess's arm tightly, but her grip felt like clutching air. Jess pulled free suddenly, her movements jerky and unnatural, almost like she wasn't fully in control. The chanting grew louder around us, echoing through the trees like a dark, twisted symphony, pulling us deeper into the forest's shadow. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. Leah and I exchanged terrified looks, realizing we had to get out of there. But Jess wasn't herself anymore, and she wasn't going anywhere without a fight. Then Jess let out a guttural, inhuman sound and charged blindly toward the dense underbrush. I shouted after her, but my voice was swallowed up by the thick woods. The silence that followed was worse than the chanting, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Panic and dread clenched me tight as Leah and I scrambled after Jess, desperate to save her before it was too late. We ran after Jess, branches clawing at our faces and clothes as the trail twisted and narrowed beneath the dusk sky. The forest felt alive. The chanting faded behind us, replaced by an eerie silence so thick it pressed on my chest. Leah called Jess's name, but only her ragged breathing answered back. Suddenly, Jess stumbled and collapsed onto the ground, eyes wide but unseeing. Panic surged through me as Leah dropped to her knees beside her, shaking her friend and pleading for her to wake up. I scanned the shadows around us, half expecting the strange presence to emerge, but nothing moved. The forest remained still and empty, except for the faint glow of the fading sunset filtering through the leaves. We knew we couldn't stay here. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. With heavy hearts, Leah and I helped Jess to her feet, deciding to cut the night short and head back to the parking lot before whatever haunted the woods found us all. The forest grew darker as the last light slipped away, shadows thickening and deepening between the twisted trees. Jess lay unconscious, her skin pale and cold between Leah and me, the fading daylight barely touching her face. Suddenly, Leah's eyes snapped open, but they weren't her own. They rolled back eerily, and her body stiffened, jerking unnaturally. A guttural, low voice slipped from her lips, chilling me to the core. I grabbed her arm, but she shrugged me off with a strength she shouldn't have had. The air thickened, heavy and suffocating, as if the forest itself was closing in. The voices returned, overlapping in a haunting, endless chorus, trapping us in an invisible prison of dread. Desperation clawed at me as I shouted Leah's name, trying to pull her back from whatever dark force had taken hold. The quiet trail we had walked confidently now felt like a sinister trap, and the night promised horrors far beyond our understanding. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. Panic surged through me as I grabbed Leah's arm, pulling her hard toward the trailhead. The voices echoed all around us, twisted and maddening, while dark shadows slithered between the trees like living things. Jess still lay limp in my other arm, her face pale and cold, and fear pushed me forward faster than I thought possible. The forest felt endless, but the parking lot had to be close. My heart hammered so loud I thought it might burst. When we finally broke through the dense tree line and saw the cars, relief washed over me like escaping a nightmare. We piled into the nearest vehicle, locking the doors behind us, trembling and almost speechless. The hike was over. Whatever had haunted that trail would remain behind us, at least for now. But as the engine roared to life, I couldn't shake the creeping feeling that the forest had marked us, and this wasn't the last we'd hear of those voices.